On the afternoon of the 7th of September 1940, the people of London heard a sound they had been dreading for years, the ominous drone of aero engines. High above, the sky filled with waves of German bombers, and a torrent of high explosives and incendiaries began to rain down on the British capital. The bombardment continued through the night, and by the following morning, the East End and the London docks were ablaze, and 1,000 Londoners lay dead and hundreds more severely injured. The Blitz had begun. Over the next 76 days, London and other southern British cities like Bristol, Portsmouth, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Sheffield would suffer near continuous aerial bombardment, losing more than 2 million houses and over 100,000 civilian casualties. Throughout the bombing campaign, the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command fought valiantly to beat back the invaders, soon forcing the Luftwaffe to abandon daylight bombing in favour of night raids. Yet, despite the blackouts enforced across the country, German bomber crews always seemed to find their targets and bomb them with uncanny accuracy. Through brilliant detective work, British intelligence soon discovered the reason the Germans had a secret weapon, a series of invisible radio beams that could guide their bombers directly to their targets even in pitch darkness. The British effort to uncover the secrets of these beams and develop the means of jamming them was one of the great unsung technical achievements of the war and proved decisive in turning the tide of the Blitz. This is the forgotten story of the Battle of the Beams. Our story begins in November 1939, 2 months after Nazi Germany launched their invasion of Poland and ignited the Second World War. On November 2nd, an anonymous source, later identified as German mathematician and physicist Hans Meyer, mailed 2 letters to the British Embassy in Oslo, Norway, which immediately passed them along to MI6, British Foreign Intelligence. The Oslo report, as it became known, contained a bonanza of information on German weapons then under development, including radar, remote-controlled bombs, long-range rockets, and acoustic torpedoes. And among the technologies summarized in the report was one that would soon become of utmost interest to British planners, a single-beam radio apparatus that could accurately measure a bomber aircraft's heading and range, allowing it to be guided onto its target. One of the greatest intelligence leaks in military history, the Oslo report gave the Allies an invaluable scoop on many of the advanced German weapons they would later face on the battlefield. Fast forward to early 1940, the 8-month period between Britain and France's declaration of war on September 3rd, 1939, and Germany's invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10th, 1940 saw relatively little military action on either side, being sarcastically referred to as the Phony War or Sitz Krieg. However, the German Luftwaffe did conduct a number of small-scale reconnaissance and bombing raids over the British Isles during this period, and in March of 1940, the Royal Air Force shot down a Heinkel HE-111 bomber of Kampfgruppe or KG-26 near London. Inside the wreckage, British military intelligence found a small scrap of paper belonging to the aircraft's navigator, which bore the mysterious note, "Navigational aid, radio beacons working on beacon plan A." Additionally, from 600 hours, beacon Duhnen, light beacon after dark, radio beacon Knickbein from 600 hours on 315 degrees. A few days later, another HE-111 from KG-26 was shot down, aboard which was discovered a diary containing the following entry. 5/3/40. 2/3 of staff on leave. In afternoon, tidied about Knickbein, collapsible boats, etc. The word Knickbein baffled intelligence analysts. Literally translating as crooked leg, it was also the name of a legendary raven in Germanic mythology who had the ability to see over great distances. In search of answers, they turned to squadron leader Samuel Felkin, the chief air intelligence interrogator based at Trent Park in Cockfosters, North London. A grand 18th century country manor at the outbreak of war, Trent Park was commandeered by the Air Ministry as a centre for interrogating captured German airmen. In addition to formal interrogation, the Cockfosters cage, as it became known, also made use of microphones hidden throughout the estate to eavesdrop on private conversations between unsuspecting prisoners. During one interrogation, squadron leader Felkin asked a German bomber navigator about the mysterious Knickerbeam. Although initially evasive, the prisoner eventually revealed that it was a radio navigation system like X-Gerät, but used a shortwave signal whose beam was less than a kilometre wide over the target. This information was duly passed to Professor Reginald Victor, or R.V. Jones, a physicist who, in 1939, had been appointed Assistant Director of Scientific Intelligence at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. Throughout the war, Jones would play a vital role in teasing out the secrets of advanced German military technology, including radar and the long-range V weapons. In a May 23, 1940 report titled "Indication of New German Weapons to be Used Against England," Jones wrote, "It is possible that they have developed a system of intersecting beams so that they can locate a target such as London with sufficient accuracy for indiscriminate bombing. No information is available concerning the wavelength to to be employed, but the accuracy expected by the Germans is something like a half mile over London from the west frontier of Germany. Efforts are still being made to determine the probable wavelengths so that countermeasures can be employed. Soon the need to learn more about this system would become extremely urgent, for on May 10, 1940, the Germans launched Full Gelb, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. In only 6 weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was pushed back to the coast and evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, while a defeated France capitulated and signed an armistice with the Germans. And for more on this unnecessarily humiliating process, please do check out our previous video, yet another of Hitler's ultimate dick moves. With France now conquered, the Germans turned their attention to subduing the British Isles. In the tiniest of silver linings, the lightning invasion of France provided British military intelligence with valuable information on the mysterious Nickebean system. But this intelligence came not from crashed German aircraft or the interrogation of prisoners of war, but a far more powerful and closely guarded source: the cracking of the German Enigma cipher, codenamed Ultra. The invasion of France moved so rapidly that forward units of the Luftwaffe were forced to communicate with each other via radio. These signals were in turn picked up by radio listening stations of the British WWII service and passed to the Ultra code breakers at the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, for decipherment. On June 5, 1940, the WWII service intercepted a signal sent from a German bomber flying over England to the chief signals officer of the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps 4, which when deciphered read, "Nickebean Cleve is established at 53 degrees 24 north and 1 degree west." Analysts immediately recognized Cleve as the German spelling of Cleves, a town in the Lower Rhine region of Germany, and famously the birthplace of Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of English King Henry VIII. The town made perfect sense as a site for a radio navigation beacon, being the westernmost point in Germany and thus the closest to the British Isles. Meanwhile, the coordinates in the message were traced to a point near Retford, Nottinghamshire, where the Great North Road, or A1 highway, intersected the 1 degree west meridian. Amusingly, the Air Ministry originally assumed that the message indicated that a spy had set up a secret radio navigation beacon in the area and dispatched troops and police officers to find and arrest him. However, when the message reached R.V. Jones, he interpreted it to mean the transmitting bomber had picked up the navigation beam from Cleves at that location. Indeed, other intelligence revealed that aircraft of Fliegerkorps 4th Squadron, specifically KG-4 and KG-37, had been operating over England on June 5th. Tracing the line from Cleves to Retford, Jones further deduced that the beam had been intended to guide the bombers to Sheffield, but had been misaligned. Armed with this information, on June 12th, Jones met Group Captain Leicester F. Blandy, Deputy Director of Signals Intelligence, and Professor Frederick Lindemann, Jones's old tutor at Oxford and official scientific advisor to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. To Jones's dismay, Lindemann immediately dismissed the feasibility of a long-range navigational beam, arguing that at the high frequencies indicated by captured Luftwaffe airmen, radio signals would be blocked by the curvature of the Earth and would be unable to reach England from Germany. Undaunted, Jones unearthed a paper by one T.L. Eckersley, a radio propagation expert from the Marconi Company and a consultant for the WWII service, which indicated that a VHF signal transmitted from Cleves should indeed be detectable over England. And there was more good news. Back at the Cockfosters' cage, a conversation between a group of German airmen about Nickebean was secretly recorded, in which one prisoner boasted that the British would never find the mysterious system. As luck would have it, on October 28, 1939, just 2 months after the outbreak of war, a Heinkel HE-111 of KG-26 was shot down and crash-landed near Edinburgh, Scotland, and its radio equipment was captured intact and thoroughly examined. Jones contacted the man who had examined the equipment, one squadron leader Cox Walker, and yes, that was his real name, and asked him if there was anything unusual about it. At first, Cox Walker said no, the bomber was equipped with a standard FUG-10 shortwave transceiver and an EBL-2 Lorenz blind landing set. But then, after a moment, he exclaimed, "Wait a minute. Yes. You know, we were surprised that the Lorenz set seems so much more sensitive than they would need for blind landing." Jones had his answer. Developed in 1932 by German firm C. Lorenz AG and first used on a large scale by national airline Lufthansa, the Lorenz blind landing system was designed to allow pilots to find and align themselves with a runway at night or in bad weather. The system comprised a set of antennas mounted at the end of the runway which transmitted over 2 overlapping Morse code signal beams, one composed of dots and the other of dashes. The timing of the dots and dashes was arranged such that where 2 beams overlapped, the signals merged into a continuous tone known as the equisignal. To use the system, a pilot located one of the 2 beams using an onboard radio receiver and adjusted his course laterally until he heard the equisignal in his headphones. He then continued along that course, adjusting left or right if the equisignal gave way to a string of dots or dashes. crashes. In this manner, he could be guided onto the center of the runway and even the poorest visibility. Nicobene worked the same way, but in reverse, with the aircraft flying away rather than towards the transmitting antennas. However, thanks to the high signal frequencies used, the beams were only a few hundred meters wide by the time they reached London and other southern English cities, accurate enough for strategic bombing. However, while the Lorenz system could give a bomber the correct heading towards a target, it could not give its range, that is, the proper point at which to drop its bombs. For this reason, a second beam operating at a different frequency was used, the two antennas being arranged so that the beams intersected over the target. As a particularly cooperative Luftwaffe prisoner of war codenamed A231 explained, as soon as the aircraft picks up the beam, the pilot flies a level course, seeing that the turn and bank indicators and the artificial horizon all read 0. He then flies along the beam. Once close to the target, the navigators switch to the second beam frequency. As soon as the aircraft entered the equisignal of that beam, the bombardier released the bombs. A231 also sketched out the prototype Nicobene antenna that he had seen at the Reich Air Ministry or RLM Development Center at Rechlin, which was identical to an antenna photographed by the Royal Air Force at Hornum in northern Germany, but which military intelligence had been unable to identify. The name Nicobene, or crooked leg, was derived from the asymmetric shape of the transmitting antenna, though the connection to a far-seeing mythological raven was likely also intentional. As we will see, this is not the first time that the Germans picked a far too obvious code name to their own detriment. Once again, Jones presented his findings to Frederick Lindemann, who, thoroughly convinced this time, wrote to Winston Churchill on June the 13th that, quote, "There seems to be some reason to suppose that the Germans have some type of radio device with which they hope to find their targets. Whether this is come for of the RDF or some other invention, it is vital to investigate and especially to seek to discover what the wavelength is. If we know this, we could devise a means to mislead them. With your approval, I will take this up with the Air Ministry and try to stimulate action." Churchill, in turn, passed on Lindemann's recommendation to Secretary of State for Air Sir Archibald Sinclair, adding a note that "this seems most intriguing and I hope you will have it thoroughly examined." Air Marshal Philip Joubert was duly appointed to head an official investigation into Nicobene, with the first priority being to determine what frequencies at which the twin beams were transmitted. He wouldn't have to wait long. On June the 18th, Air Intelligence received an assortment of papers captured from German aircraft shot down over France before the Dunkirk evacuation, one of which confirmed the location of a second Nicobene transmitter at Bredstedt in Schleswig-Holstein, northern Germany. More valuable intelligence soon fell into British hands, literally. Indeed, use of the Nicobene led to many German bomber crews becoming careless, with some even leaving their navigation lights on. This made them highly vulnerable to British night fighters, which in the absence of effective airborne intercept radar normally found it impossible to locate and shoot down German aircraft in the dark. On June the 19th, the Heinkel HE-111 of KG-4 was shot down, whose navigator's log revealed the first beam frequency to be 31.5 MHz. 2 days later, a German navigator bailed out of his bomber, only to realize that he still had his logbook on him. He valiantly proceeded to shred the book into tiny pieces, but was arrested before he could fully destroy the evidence. The book was painstakingly pieced back together like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing, among other things, that the second beam frequency was 30 MHz. With this vital information in hand, all that remained was to actually detect the beams as they crossed over England. To this end, Wing Commander Robert S. Bluch of the Blind Landing Development Flight at Boscombe Down had 3 Avro Anson training and maritime patrol aircraft fitted with American-made Hallecrafter S-27 receivers, the only radios available in the UK that could detect the high-frequency Nicobene beams. Indeed, it is rumoured that an Air Ministry representative brought up the entire stock of Webb's radio shop in Soho on credit. Never designed for use aboard aircraft, the radios had to be extensively modified for the task, for example being adapted to run off an aircraft's 28 volts DC electrical system rather than the typical 250 volts AC household supply. And while the Ansons were aging and rather rickety aircraft by this point, they were all that could be spared. This was, after all, the height of the invasion scare, when even de Havilland Tiger Moth training biplanes were being fitted with bomb racks in a desperate hope of fending off landing German troops. One of the modified aircraft, its radio manned by a volunteer from the Y service, made its first flight on June the 19th, but this was cut short by a faulty generator. The crew tried again the following day, but failed to intercept the beams. And before another flight could be attempted, on June the 21st, a meeting was called at 10 Downing Street, chaired by Prime Minister Winston Churchill and attended by Sir Archibald Sinclair, Sinclair, Secretary of State for Air, Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, Henry Tizard and Robert Watson Watt, two of the inventors of radar, and Frederick Lindemann. Amusingly, R.V. Jones discovered the meeting invitation on his desk after the meeting had already begun and was forced to scramble to Whitehall to present his findings. In their finest hour, this second volume of his book series, The Second World War, Winston Churchill recalled, "Being master, and not having to argue too much, once I was convinced about the principles of this queer and deadly game, I gave all the necessary orders that very day in June for the existence of the beams to be assumed for all countermeasures to receive absolute priority. The slightest reluctance or deviation in carrying out this policy was to be reported to me." However, that same afternoon, Jones was pulled into another meeting at the Air Ministry, attended by members of the RAF Signals Office and the Air Ministry Research Establishment, including Lindemann and Marconi Company consultant T.L. Eckersley. To Jones's shock, Lindemann proceeded to restate his previous opinion that VHF signals, like those supposedly used by Nicobene, could not possibly reach England from Germany due to the Earth's curvature. To his even greater shock, Eckersley backed this view, stating, as another attendee recalled, in his opinion, the reception at any distance of this wavelength was quite impossible, and that he'd stake his reputation on the statement. As Jones later wrote, "It was an absolute blow from my point of view, because if that really were true, all the fuss that I had been the cause of would now be exploded, and what would happen to me for the rest of my life was problematic. I pointed out to Eckersley that I'd used one of his own papers to convince Lindemann that this showed quite clearly that the beams would go that far. Oh, he said, well, you don't want to believe that. I was showing how far they might go, but I don't really think they would go as far as that." Nonetheless, Jones managed to convince the committee to allow the modified Ansons at Boscombe Down to make one final flight in search of the Nicobene beams. That same evening, an Anson crewed by one Flight Lieutenant Bufton and Corporal Mackey from Y Service took off and began zigzagging across the Wiltshire countryside. Within minutes, they succeeded in locating the two Nicobene beams at 31.5 and 30 MHz, exactly as Air Intelligence had predicted. Tellingly, the beams crossed over the Rolls-Royce aircraft engine plant in Derby, the only establishment producing the legendary Merlin V12 engine that powered the Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane fighters that were soon to become vitally important to Britain's survival. Jones was ecstatic, writing that it is fitting to close the account as far as scientific intelligence is concerned. In the course of 10 days, the matter has developed from conjecture to certainty. Several technical points remain to be cleared up, but their elucidation is only a matter of time. If our good fortunes hold, we may yet pull the crooked leg. Stubbornly, Eckersley stood his ground, declaring that the navigation beams did not extend with any great distance within our coastline, are in the nature of freaks. But Jones had made his case, and soon a new unit dubbed 80 Wing, commanded by RAF Signals Office Group Captain E.B. Addison, was established to develop countermeasures against Nicobene. This could not have come at a better time, for on June the 10th, 1940, the Luftwaffe finally launched a concerted bombing campaign against British airfields and aircraft factories in an effort to destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground. The Battle of Britain had begun. Though this campaign is often characterized as a prelude to invasion, in reality the Germans were ill-equipped to invade the British Isles, and the bombing was indeed intended to destroy Britain's fighting ability and force the government to the negotiating table. Famously, however, the pilots of the RAF Fighter Command, aided by the Chain Home Early Warning Radar Network and the highly efficient Dowding system of command and control, proved more than a match for the German intruders. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe had been developed as a tactical air force for providing close air support to advancing troops, not as a long-range strategic force. Escort fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 thus had only enough fuel to linger for 15 minutes over England, whereupon they were forced to cross back over the Channel, leaving the bombers sitting ducks for British fighters. Consequently, on September the 7th, the Germans switched to the strategic, or terror bombing of civilian centres, a campaign forever seared into the British consciousness as the Blitz. At first, the Germans bombed by both day and night, but as in the earlier phase of the battle, the unescorted bombers proved horrendously vulnerable to British fighters in daylight, and raids were soon conducted exclusively at night. By this time, further Nicobene transmitters had been constructed near Cherbourg and Dieppe on the coast of newly occupied France. Being much closer to Britain, these transmitters generated stronger signals to guide the night raiders to their targets. At first, the British were all but helpless in the face of this nocturnal onslaught. With effective airborne and gun-laying radar still under development, searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were woefully inaccurate and night fighters effectively blind. But there was one hope. jam the nickel beams, and lead the bombers away from their targets. This was easier said than done, for no radio sets commonly used in the UK at the time could transmit at the high frequencies used by the navigation beams. However, someone in the Air Ministry realised that there was a type of device that could: diathermy machines. Still used to this day in physical therapy, diathermy sets use high-voltage, high-frequency electricity to induce heating in deep muscle tissue. Operating in frequencies in excess of 30 MHz, they were ideal for interfering with the nickel beams. In another very British feat of subterfuge, a diathermy expert from Harley Street in London was instructed to don a flight lieutenant's uniform and commandeer as many diathermy sets as he could from hospitals and private clinics. These were modified into 150-watt VHF radio transmitters and installed across the country, many in rural police stations in towns like Glastonbury and Wimborne Minster. Unfortunately, the modified diathermy sets proved underpowered and ineffective. However, the telecommunications research establishment in Matravers near Swanage soon succeeded in developing a more powerful jamming transmitter codenamed Aspirin, reference to the official codename Headache for the navigation beams. Eventually, 28 Aspirin jammers would be installed along the Channel coast. Meanwhile, 80 Wing, now renamed 190 Squadron, flew nightly missions in radio-equipped Ansons and Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley medium bombers to locate the navigation beams, these flights being supplemented by stationary VHF receivers mounted on chain-home radar towers at Otterkops, Bawdsley, West Beckham, Stanton Wold, and Dover. The beams proved relatively easy to find due to the peculiar German habit of switching on the transmitters long before a raid began. British intelligence assumed this was done to train the transmitter's crews, but it could not understand why the Germans insisted on aiming the beams over the British Isles rather than the vast area of Europe they now controlled. It was one of many careless mistakes that would eventually cost the Germans dearly. Once the location and bearing of the nickel beams was established, the appropriate Aspirin transmitters would be switched on to lead them off course. Aspirin worked by transmitting a spoof signal of Morse code dots, which would overlap and mask the original signal and make it almost impossible for bomber crews to locate the correct equisignal. When used correctly, this countermeasure could be spectacularly effective, as revealed by an Air Ministry report on a Heinkel HE-111 bomber of KG-55 that was brought down during a night raid on Birmingham. This particular aircraft had an individual target, an aircraft factory to the north of Birmingham. They picked up the beam at 13,000 feet over the channel and started to fly along it. After a time, the equisignal became variable and then disappeared altogether, and no matter how they tried, they could not pick it up again. Panic then seems to have overtaken the crew of the aircraft. They complained that the electrical apparatus of the aircraft had gone wrong, and neither the compass nor the artificial horizon were functioning properly, and that the night was so dark the pilot could not keep the aircraft on a level course. The radio operator, however, insisted that his apparatus continued to function, which tends to disprove the notion that the electrical apparatus had gone out of order. Eventually, the observer jettisoned the bombs, and he and the radio operator bailed out. The pilot and gunner were killed when the aircraft crashed. But the Germans were quick learners, and soon began switching on their navigation beams just before a raid was launched, giving the British less time to find and jam them. They also sometimes aimed the beams at a dummy target before switching them to the real target, but this also often confused the bomber crews nearly as much as the British. More experienced bomber pilots could defeat Aspirin by flying along one edge of the beams rather than down the equisignal, but such airmen were few and far between. As mentioned earlier, the Luftwaffe was designed as a tactical daylight air force, and most pilots had little experience in night instrument flying. Consequently, most bomber crews opted to navigate by what few landmarks they could make out on the dark ground below, particularly the River Thames. They also made extensive use of regular, non-directional radio beacons installed back in Germany and France. By determining the bearing of two or more known beacons using the aircraft's radio direction finding or DF loop, a navigator could accurately fix his position. However, the British were also aware of this method and devised equally clever countermeasures to defeat it. For example, civilian BBC radio stations were grouped into clusters operating at a common frequency and were shut off whenever an enemy aircraft came within 25 miles. This way, no signal station could be used as a navigation beacon. The British also developed an elaborate system whereby radio receivers on the coast picked up German radio beacon signals and relayed them via the General Post Office telephone lines to transmitters further inland for rebroadcasting, creating a confusing mess of signals that made it impossible for German navigators to fix their position. This technique, known as meakening, was impervious to any call signs, codes, or other identifiers that Germans might try to integrate into the radio signal, as these would just be automatically rebroadcast. But while clever, there was only so much Aspirin and Meekening could do, and by January 1st, 1941, the Blitz had succeeded in killing some 13,000 people, injuring 16,000, and inflicting millions of pounds of property damage in cities including London, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth, and Liverpool. Meanwhile, British intelligence learned that the Germans were preparing to deploy a new, more sophisticated radio navigation system, the mysterious X-Gerät, mentioned by the captured Luftwaffe airmen back in early 1940. Slowly, through radio intelligence and Enigma decrypts, they pieced together how the system worked. Unlike Nicobene, X-Gerät used not 2, but 4 beams, codenamed after German rivers: Weser, Rhine, Oder, and Elbe, the transmitters being located on the Hague Peninsula and in Calais-Boulogne. Weser was the pilot approach beam and worked similarly to Nicobene, giving bomber pilots their bearing towards the target. However, it operated at a much higher frequency, 65 to 75 MHz, allowing the beam to be narrower and thus more accurate. But this made the beam difficult for pilots to find, so a wider Nicobene coarse beam was added to guide them towards the fine beam equisignal. The 3 other beams, meanwhile, were transmitted crosswise to the Weser beam at specific intervals: Rhine at 30 kilometers from the target, Oder at 10 kilometers, and Elbe at 5 kilometers, giving the bombardier sequential signals as to when to drop his bombs. This system allowed for a bombing accuracy of as little as 100 meters at 300 kilometers, greater even than was usually achievable with daylight bombing. Unlike Nicobene, however, which used standard blind landing equipment already installed on all Luftwaffe bombers, X-Gerät needed specialized receiver equipment. A special unit, KGR-100, was thus formed, whose aircraft would use X-Gerät to find the target, which would then mark it using flares and incendiary bombs. Following waves of bombers would then home in on the flares and fires and drop their own payloads. Such Pathfinder tactics would later be adapted to devastating effect by the Allies in their own strategic bombing campaign against Germany. X-Gerät greatly worried R.V. Jones and the rest of the Air Ministry, for early intelligence indicated that the fine navigation beam was transmitted at a wavelength of only 10 centimeters, far beyond the ability of British radio equipment to jam. The only hope of countering the system was thus to jam the lower frequency coarse beam and make it more difficult for German pilots to locate the narrow fine beam. To this end, the British modified a number of gun-laying radar sets into countermeasures codenamed Bromide. It would later be determined that the fine beam was not in fact transmitted at 10 centimeters. Indeed, achieving this narrower wavelength required a special piece of equipment called a cavity magnetron, which had just been invented by John Randall and Harry Boot of the University of Birmingham, and which would go on to become one of the Allies' most decisive secret weapons. The Germans, meanwhile, would not develop their own magnetrons until much later in the war, after reverse engineering examples recovered from downed Allied aircraft. The fineness of the main X-Gerät beam, it turned out, was the result of the complex structure of the radio transmission itself. As an aside, while top secret at the time, cavity magnetrons are now found in nearly every household, being the key component of microwave ovens. But that's a story for another video. The bromide sets were ready by early November 1940, just in time for an anticipated large-scale raid codenamed Moonlight Sonata. Targeted against the historic medieval city of Coventry, the attack began on the evening of November the 14th. Over the next 10 hours, German aircraft dropped 503 tons of high explosives and over 30,000 incendiary bombs on the city, killing 500 people, severely injuring 1,200 more, and demolishing over 60,000 buildings, including Coventry Cathedral. One of the most devastating raids of the entire bombing campaign, the Coventry Blitz went almost entirely unopposed, with the city's anti-aircraft batteries only managing to shoot down a single German bomber. Strangely, the bromide jamming sets appeared completely ineffective, and it wouldn't be long until their designers found out why. 1 week earlier, on November the 6th, the Heinkel HE-111 of KGR-100 crash-landed in the surf at West Bay near Bridgeport in Dorset. One crew member was killed on impact, but the 3 others waded ashore and were soon captured, apparently surprised to find their captors English. Thanks to Meekening, the navigator thought they'd crash-landed in Spain. The wreck of the aircraft was soon recovered, and its X-Gerät equipment was examined. Far more sophisticated than Nicobene, the receiver used a visual rather than auditory system to indicate the aircraft's position relative to the target. This consisted of a clock-like bombing computer with 3 hands coloured green, black, and red. When the aircraft crossed the Rhine beam, the navigator heard a brief audio signal prompting him to set up the computer. Then, when the aircraft crossed the Oder beam at 10 kilometers from the target, the green and black hands began to sweep across the dial. When the aircraft crossed the Elbe beam 5 kilometers from the target, the green hand stopped, the black hand reversed back to the 12 o'clock position, and the red hand began sweeping from the black hand toward the green. As this interval represented 5 kilometers of travel, when the red hand reached the green, an aircraft traveling at a constant speed would be over the target and the bombs would be automatically released. Not only was this system far more difficult to fool than a human navigator listening to Morse code signals over the headphones, but the equipment included a very narrow band pass filter that blocked any signals that differed from the genuine Weser beam by more than 50 kilohertz. During the Coventry Blitz, the modulation of the Weser beam was set to 2000 Hz, while the bromide jammers were set to 1500 Hz, far outside the filter passband. The jammers, therefore, had no effect. Learning from their mistakes, the British duly modified the jamming frequencies, and by early December 1940, 17 bromide transmitters were deployed across the country. At the same time, Whitley bombers of 109 Squadron carried out 10 raids against the Exterat transmitters on the French coasts, but due to poor visibility, these had little effect. Though the bromides succeeded in fooling several bombers, the skilled crews of KGR-100 never relied exclusively on Exterat and used multiple navigation methods to find their targets. The British thus switched to a completely different strategy, codenamed Starfish. Starfish, or decoy fire sites, comprised large arrangements of oil burners set up in open courtyards which at night would resemble a burning town or factory and trick the bombers into dropping their bombs on the wrong target. Even more elaborate were the so-called Q sites, which used arrangements of dummy buildings and aircraft and both stationary and moving lights to simulate airfields, factories, and other installations. This strategy proved remarkably effective, with a contemporary report stating that Starfish have attracted the attention of the enemy on numerous occasions, drawing a considerable number of bombs. On the other hand, there have been some occasions, particularly when visibility conditions were good, when Starfish were ignored. Outstanding successes were achieved at Cardiff on the 4th of March 1941, at Bristol on the 16th of March, and at Portsmouth on the 17th of April. On the first occasion, home security specialists reported that no less than 102 high-explosive bombs had been aimed at the Starfish, the total weight of those bombs being 25 tons. 300 bombs were dropped on the downside Starfish Bristol. The largest number of bombs ever collected by a decoy fire fell on the Sinnar Common Starfish near Portsmouth. No less than 170 bombs, 26 landmines, 20 oil bombs, and innumerable incendiary bombs were dropped, representing 95% of the total effort against Portsmouth. It appears that the Germans were at least somewhat aware of the Starfish and Q sites, with a common storytelling of a Junkers Ju-88 mocking the British by attacking one of the sites with wooden bombs. In the end, Exterat was largely defeated by setting up a false Elba beam just 1 kilometer after the Oder beam. As the bombing computer was automatically triggered by these beams, the premature signals would cause the bombs to be released 4 kilometers early. However, this tactic was not always effective, as by now the Germans had learned to only switch on the Exterat beams at the last possible moment, making it difficult for the British to properly set up the false Elba beam in time. But once again, the Germans had another trick up their sleeves, and in early 1941, Y-service listening stations began picking up a new navigation signal transmitted at between 42 and 39 megahertz. At the same time, Enigma decrypts revealed the installation of a transmitter codenamed Wotan near Cherbourg and Brest in occupied France. Suspecting that the name contained a clue to the transmitter's function, R.V. Jones contacted Professor Frederick Norman at the Code Breaking Center at Bletchley Park. He said, well, he was the head of the German gods. Then he said, wait a minute, one eye, one beam. He shouted down the telephone, one beam, can you make a system work with one beam? And I said I could use one beam in the ordinary war, and then, for example, we could use the ranging system mentioned in the Oslo report. He said, that'll be it. And so we started to look. As luck would have it, in November 1940, an Enigma message had been intercepted instructing the Luftwaffe to designate Target Number 1 for Y. Target Number 1 was known to be a code name for the Royal Armoured Corps depot in Bovington, Dorset, and as the message was sent to only a single transmission station, this confirmed that the new navigation system known as WWII only used one beam. Once again, the Germans' penchant for clever, far too descriptive code names had worked against them. It was a mistake which, in the post-war period, would lead the British to develop a truly bizarre system of weapons naming known as the Rainbow Codes. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, Death by Blue Peacock, Britain's Bizarre and Deadly Cold War Rainbow Codes. The directional function of WWII worked similarly to Nicobene and Exterat, with pilots following a narrow guide beam. Instead of crossbeams, however, the range of an aircraft was determined using a transponder system, with the onboard FUG-28A transceiver receiving a signal from the ground station and immediately rebroadcasting it back. By comparing the modulation phase of the two signals, the transit time and thus the range of the aircraft could be accurately determined using only a single beam. Even better, a pilot did not have to ride the beam the entire way, as the ground station could determine his aircraft's position at any time, and they could radio course corrections to keep him on target. Despite all of this, however, WWII Wajdarat had a number of glaring weaknesses. Firstly, being an automatic system, it was potentially easier to fool than an experienced human radio operator. Second, the retransmitted transponder signal could be homed in on by suitably equipped night fighters. Thirdly, only one aircraft could be guided by each ground station at a time, making the whole system much easier to disrupt. And finally, the system operated at 45 MHz, an unintentionally poor choice of frequency, as it would turn out. Indeed, of all the German navigation beam systems, Wajdarat proved the easiest to defeat. The countermeasures the British developed, codenamed Domino, comprised a radio receiver at Swains Lane in Highgate, which picked up the Wajdarat beam and transmitted it via telephone lines to the BBC television transmitter at Alexandra Palace in North London, where it was boosted and rebroadcast. The site of the first experimental public television broadcasts in the 1930s, this station was shut down on the outbreak of war, but reactivated when it was realized it operated at the same 45 MHz frequency as Wajdarat. This jamming scheme worked so well that for weeks the Germans thought that there was some inherent technical flaw with Wajdarat itself. When they finally realized that the British had been jamming their signals from the outset, the Luftwaffe completely lost faith in electronic navigation aids. By this time, however, the German bombing campaign against Britain was coming to an end. The introduction of new fighters like the Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with the compact and powerful Airborne Intercept or AI Mark IV radar, finally succeeded in sweeping the intruders from the night sky, while at the same time Adolf Hitler began redeploying his forces east in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. After 8 months and 5 days, the Blitz officially came to an end on May the 11th, 1941. While the so-called Battle of the Beams was just one part of a much larger effort to counter the German aerial onslaught, it was nonetheless a vital one. As Jones later recalled, this had been our only defense. Night fighters, until airborne radar was good enough, were powerless anti-aircraft guns were inaccurate, therefore we could not stop the bombers. Our only hope was to throw them off. Well, we didn't always succeed, but we did certainly on a few number of occasions, with the result that a good many people were alive at the end of the war who otherwise wouldn't have been, and a good deal less vital damage was done. If one thinks of what could have happened with Nickebein, or the German Air Force could have bombed accurately, well, we saw what happened when things went wrong, as at Coventry. That could have happened every night. But the Battle of the Beams was to have another, even greater impact on the course of the war. From 1942 onwards, the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force carried out a concerted campaign of round-the-clock strategic bombing against Germany in occupied Europe. Pathfinder units, first deployed during the Blitz, played a key role in this campaign, as did electronic navigation aids like G-OBO and H-2S ground scanning radar. By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the bombardment had left countless German cities and towns in ruins, and over 600,000 German citizens dead. By demonstrating the effectiveness of strategic bombing tactics, the Germans had ironically contributed to their own demise. As the commander of RAF Bomber Command, Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, famously stated on June 3, 1942, the Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half 100 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.